In January 1536, on a jousting field at Greenwich Palace, the most powerful king in England was thrown from his horse in full armour and lay motionless on the ground for 2 hours, while his physicians stood over him, unable to determine whether the man who controlled the Church of England, the treasury of a kingdom, and the lives of everyone within it was going to wake up. And when Henry VIII finally opened his eyes, the people closest to him noticed almost immediately that something had changed, something they could not quite name or document, but that would become, in retrospect, the single most consequential medical event of the 16th century. Before we go further, if you want history examined the way a forensic scientist examines a crime scene, subscribe and leave a like right now, because what this video does to Henry VIII's story is exactly what this channel does to every story. It goes past the official version and finds what the evidence actually says. The Henry VIII that most people know, the bloated, paranoid, wife-executing tyrant of popular history, was not the Henry VIII who came to the throne in 1509, and the distance between those two versions of the same man is so extreme, so specifically documented across contemporary letters and court records and diplomatic dispatches, that historians have been trying for nearly 5 centuries to explain what happened to him, because the young Henry was by every available account genuinely impressive, tall, athletic, multilingual, a composer of music, a theologian capable of debating with the finest minds in Europe, a man whom Thomas More described as having more learning, eloquence and wisdom than any English king before him, and whom every foreign ambassador who met him in his early reign described in terms that read less like diplomatic flattery and more like genuine admiration. The first documented head injury came in March 1524, 12 years before the famous Greenwich accident, when Henry was participating in a jousting tournament, and his opponent's lance entered his open visor because Henry had forgotten to lower it and struck him directly across the face, a blow that by any modern medical understanding would have produced at minimum a significant concussion, and that contemporary sources describe as producing symptoms consistent with exactly that: headaches, temporary confusion, and a period of withdrawal from his normal activities that his courtiers noted with the specific anxiety of people whose well-being depends entirely on the health of one man. The second major head injury came in 1527, from a fall while pole vaulting, a sport Henry had taken up with the same physical enthusiasm he brought to everything in those years when the pole snapped and he fell headfirst into a ditch of standing water, was briefly unconscious, and was pulled from the water by his attendants in a state that the witnesses described with the specific terror of people who have just watched their king nearly drown in a drainage channel, an injury that his physicians treated and his court quietly minimised in the reports that went to foreign ambassadors, because the appearance of royal invulnerability was as politically important as the reality of royal health. The Greenwich accident of January 1536 was different from everything that had come before it, not merely in its severity, though the 2 hours of unconsciousness were unprecedented and alarming, but in its timing, because it happened at a moment when Henry's life was already in crisis. Anne Boleyn was pregnant again, the succession still unresolved, the political consequences of the English Reformation still reverberating through every relationship England had with Catholic Europe, and the pressure on Henry to produce a male heir had been building for 20 years, in a way that had already driven him to break with Rome, execute his closest advisor Thomas More, and send his second wife to the scaffold, and into this already fracturing psychological landscape. The January 1536 accident introduced something the human brain is not designed to absorb without consequence. The research team at Yale Memory Clinic that published the definitive neurological study of Henry VIII's traumatic brain injuries identified what they called diffuse axonal injury, a specific type of brain damage that occurs when the brain is violently shaken inside the skull, tearing the long connecting fibres between neurons, a type of injury now most commonly associated with rugby players and American football athletes who sustain repeated impacts, and whose long-term consequences include exactly the symptoms that contemporaries documented in Henry from the mid-1530s onward: increased aggression, impaired impulse control, memory difficulties, paranoia, depression, and the specific inability to regulate emotional responses that turns a man who was capable of genuine warmth and intellectual generosity into someone whose courtiers learned to read his mood from the sound of his footsteps in the corridor before they saw his face. The personality change that the historical record documents after 1536 is so consistent across so many independent sources, English courtiers, foreign ambassadors, the letters of people who had known Henry for decades, that it has the specific quality of something medically real rather than something politically constructed, because the people writing these letters had no reason to coordinate their observations or to produce a consistent narrative. They were simply recording what they saw. And what they saw was a man who was increasingly forgetting things he had known for years, who was flying into rages over matters that the young Henry would have handled with the easy confidence of someone who knew his own power without needing to demonstrate it, and who had developed a specific pattern of turning against the people closest to him: Thomas Cromwell, Thomas More, Catherine Howard, the entire sequence of people who had served him most loyally with a suddenness and completeness that his contemporaries found both terrifying and inexplicable. The leg ulcers that developed after the 1536 accident and that Henry would carry for the remaining 11 years of his life are the second strand of the medical story, and the one that has received the least attention, despite being documented in extraordinary detail in a manuscript that has been sitting in the British Library for centuries, because the Sloane MS 1047, a medical document containing the specific prescriptions used to treat Henry's ulcers by his royal physicians' lists, with period-appropriate Latin precision, the compounds applied to the king's legs. And when modern chemists have analysed these compounds, they have found in them consistently high concentrations of lead in multiple forms, applied directly to open wounds in a man whose leg ulcers never fully healed, which means the surface of his skin was compromised in exactly the way that maximises the absorption of whatever is being applied to it. Lead poisoning through skin absorption from medicinal preparations was not understood as a danger in the 16th century. Lead had been used in medical preparations since antiquity, was considered to have astringent and healing properties, and the physicians who applied these compounds to Henry's legs were acting in complete good faith, according to the best medical knowledge available to them, which is what makes this particular strand of the story so specifically disturbing, because the people who were trying to heal Henry VIII were also, through no fault or intention of their own, slowly introducing into his body, at the site of open wounds, a heavy metal whose documented psychiatric effects include aggression, paranoia, personality change, and cognitive decline, the precise constellation of symptoms that his court spent 11 years navigating around in increasingly desperate attempts to survive proximity to the most unpredictable man in England. The clinical picture that emerges when you combine the traumatic brain injury evidence with the lead poisoning evidence is one that modern neurologists and toxicologists who have studied the Henry VIII case describe with a specific professional interest. Because what you have is two independent causes, each capable of producing the documented symptoms on their own, operating simultaneously in the same person across the same period of time, which means the mystery is not why Henry became what he became, but rather why anyone is surprised that he did, because what happened to Henry VIII from 1536 onward is not a historical puzzle requiring a psychological explanation, but a medical consequence requiring a medical understanding. The specific timeline of Henry's behavioural deterioration maps almost precisely onto the medical evidence in a way that coincidence cannot explain the first subtle personality changes documented by courtiers in 1534 and 1535, before the Greenwich accident, align with the period when his earlier head injuries were producing the cumulative neurological effects that the Yale study describes as the long-term consequence of repeated concussive trauma. The sharp stepwise deterioration after January 1536 aligns exactly with the severe additional brain injury of the Greenwich accident, and the progressive worsening through the late 1530s and 1540s aligns with both the continued lead exposure from the ongoing treatment of his leg ulcers and the natural progression of chronic traumatic encephalopathy in a brain that has sustained repeated significant injuries. The executions that define Henry VIII's reputation in the popular imagination, More in 1535, Fisher in 1535, Anne Boleyn in 1536, Cromwell in 1540, Catherine Howard in 1542, cluster so specifically in the years after the documented medical events that the pattern itself becomes a form of evidence, because the Henry who executed More and Fisher was already showing the early signs of neurological compromise from the 1524 and 1527 head injuries. The Henry who executed Anne Boleyn was in the immediate aftermath of the most severe brain injury of his life. And the Henry who executed Cromwell, the man who had made his reformation possible, who had dissolved the monasteries and filled his treasury and managed the administrative machinery of his reign for a decade, was a man whose capacity for the kind of nuanced, long-term loyalty that keeps capable people alive was being progressively eroded by processes happening inside his skull and inside his bloodstream that neither he nor anyone around him had the vocabulary to describe. Thomas Cromwell's execution in 1540 is the moment that most clearly illustrates the specific quality of Henry's post-1536 decision-making, because Cromwell was not merely a servant who had outlived his usefulness, or a minister who had made a politically recoverable mistake. He was the architect of the English Reformation, the man whose administrative genius had made Henry VIII's vision of an independent English church operationally possible, whose dissolution of the monasteries had transferred an estimated quarter of England's landed wealth to the crown, and whose political management of an increasingly dangerous European diplomatic situation had kept England solvent and defensible. And Henry had him arrested, charged with treason and heresy on evidence that his own council subsequently described as thin, and executed within weeks, a decision so strategically irrational that historians who study it as a political calculation cannot make it add up, while historians who study it as a medical symptom find it entirely consistent with the pattern of impulsive decision-making that progressive traumatic brain injury produces. The weight gain that made Henry VIII visually iconic by his final decade, the image of the vast, immovable figure that Holbein painted and that has defined the popular understanding of him ever since, was itself partly a medical consequence, rather than simply a personal failing, because the pituitary dysfunction that the Yale study identified as a potential consequence of his head injuries affects the regulation of appetite, metabolism, and weight in ways that Henry's contemporaries could observe but could not explain, and because the chronic pain of his leg ulcers, which contemporaries describe as capable of making him howl, had forced him out of the daily athletic activity that had for 30 years been his primary method of managing both his weight and his emotional regulation, leaving him in a body that was failing him in multiple systems simultaneously, while his mind, already compromised, tried to maintain the performance of absolute royal authority over a court that was watching him very carefully for any sign that the performance was breaking down. The specific quality of the fear that Henry's court lived with in his final decade is documented in a way that goes beyond the normal anxiety of people serving an absolute monarch. It is described in contemporary letters with a specificity that reads like a clinical description of life with someone suffering from severe traumatic brain injury and heavy metal poisoning. The specific unpredictability, the way that the same statement could produce warmth one day and rage the next. The way that loyalty seemed to offer no protection against accusation. The way that Henry's memory of events and of the people around him had become unreliable in ways that created a permanent state of uncertainty in everyone who served him. Because a king who correctly remembers what you said last Tuesday is navigable, but a king who may or may not remember it, and who may respond to any contradiction of his memory with a charge of treason, is a king whose court can only survive by treating every interaction as potentially the last. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, executed in 1542 at an age historians estimate at between 16 and 21 years, represents perhaps the most extreme illustration of what the post-1536 Henry was capable of, not because her execution was more unjust than the others, though it was, but because the speed with which Henry moved from infatuation to execution, the completeness of the emotional reversal, and the specific pattern of the accusations against her all show the particular fingerprint of a mind that has lost the capacity for the sustained emotional complexity that long-term human relationships require, replacing it with a binary system in which people are either entirely safe or entirely threatening, with no stable territory in between. A pattern that the neurological literature on traumatic brain injury describes with clinical precision as one of its most consistent behavioural consequences. The diplomatic correspondence of foreign ambassadors at Henry's court in the 1540s reads, when examined as a medical document rather than as a political one, like a series of detailed case studies in the behavioural consequences of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The French ambassador's description of Henry's increasing difficulty remembering conversations, the imperial ambassador's account of Henry's rage at a courtier for repeating something Henry himself had said, the consistent picture across multiple independent national sources of a man whose cognitive and emotional systems were operating with increasing unreliability, while the institutional machinery of monarchy continued to function around him, maintained by the people who served him, and who understood that their survival depended on the performance and normalcy that was becoming harder every year to sustain. The MacLeod syndrome theory, proposed by medical historians as a third possible contributing factor alongside the traumatic brain injuries and the lead poisoning, adds a genetic dimension to the picture that explains something the other theories cannot fully account for: the pattern of reproductive tragedy that ran through Henry's marriages, with Catherine of Aragon experiencing multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, Anne Boleyn miscarrying a son after her initial successful pregnancy, and the broader pattern of a late-term pregnancy loss that haunted his domestic life, because MacLeod syndrome, a rare X-linked genetic disorder that causes progressive neurological deterioration and cardiac problems, can also cause blood incompatibility issues that specifically produce the pattern of successful early pregnancies followed by late-term losses that Henry's marriages consistently showed. The Henry who died in January 1547 at the age of 55 weighed by contemporary estimates somewhere between 300 and 350 pounds, had leg ulcers that his physicians could no longer dress without his screaming, had not left his private chambers for significant periods, had difficulty being moved from room to room, and was being governed in all practical senses by a council that had learned to manage his rages and root important decisions through the specific combination of timing and framing that minimised the risk of a catastrophic response. And yet the official portrait of this man, maintained in every public ceremonial context until his death, was still the wide-legged, broad-shouldered, physically commanding image that Holbein had painted a decade earlier. The performance of royal invulnerability maintained in the representation of the king long after the reality of his body had made it a fiction. The lead in Henry's medical treatments continued to be applied to his legs throughout the period when his behavioural deterioration was at its most extreme and his most consequential decisions were being made: the execution of Catherine Howard, the attainting of his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, that was only averted by her discovery of it and her immediate political management of his anger, the final shape of the succession that would determine whether England went to the Protestant Edward or the Catholic Mary, and the specific thought that the course of English religious history, the entire sequence of events that produced the Elizabethan settlement and the English Protestant tradition, was being shaped in part by decisions made by a brain compromised by lead, absorbed through open wounds on a king's legs, is not a dramatic historical speculation, but a medically documented possibility that changes the way every event of Henry's final decade needs to be understood. The rehabilitation of Henry VIII that some historians have attempted, the argument that his cruelty was rational statecraft, that his executions were politically necessary, that the tyrant of popular memory is an exaggeration produced by his enemies, runs into a specific problem when the medical evidence is taken seriously, because the question of whether Henry's decisions were rational depends entirely on what standard of rationality is being applied. And if the standard is the rationality of the young Henry, who debated theology with Erasmus and composed music, and managed a European diplomatic situation with genuine sophistication, then the decisions of the post-1536 Henry are not rational statecraft, but the output of a brain operating under serious neurological and toxicological impairment, which does not excuse what he did, but does fundamentally change how we understand why he did it. The specific historical irony that the research reveals is this: the physicians who attended Henry VIII were, by the medical standards of their time, doing everything correctly. They applied the best available treatments to his injuries. They managed his pain with the most effective compounds known to them. They kept him alive through illnesses that would have killed a less carefully attended man. And in doing all of this correctly, by their own standards, they were simultaneously introducing into his body the substance that was helping to destroy the mind they were trying to preserve. Which means that the most consequential medical intervention in the history of the English monarchy was not the failure of Henry's physicians, but their success. Because it was the treatment that worked, the treatment that kept him on his throne long enough to make the decisions that shaped the next 2 centuries of English history, that was doing the damage. The jousting accident of January 1536 killed Henry VIII. In the specific sense that matters most, it did not stop his heart. It did not end his reign. It did not even keep him bedridden for more than a few days. But it fundamentally altered the neurological substrate on which his personality and his judgment had been built, in a way that was invisible to the people around him, because they had no vocabulary for what had happened. And that was compounded every day by the lead being absorbed through the wounds on his legs into a bloodstream that carried it to a brain already struggling with the cumulative damage of a lifetime of violent physical contact. And what emerged from that specific convergence of medical disasters was not a monster, but something more historically interesting and more humanly disturbing than a monster. A man trapped inside the progressive failure of his own mind, executing the people closest to him with a frequency and an irrationality that his own earlier self would have found incomprehensible, ruling an empire through the institutional inertia of monarchy, while the cognitive systems that had once made him genuinely capable of ruling it were being dismantled from the inside by processes that nobody around him could see or name or stop. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, in the same month as the jousting accident that 11 years earlier had begun the final chapter of his transformation, and the England he left behind was so specifically shaped by the decisions of his post-1536 self. The execution of Cromwell that left the Reformation without its most effective administrator. The succession crisis created by the illegitimization and re-legitimization of his children in sequence. The religious settlement that was unstable enough to produce the reversals of Edward and Mary, and the final Elizabethan compromise that the entire trajectory of English history for the next century was determined in significant part by choices made by a brain working through lead and trauma, which is not a comfortable conclusion and not a simple one, but it is what the evidence says when you examine it the way a physician examines a patient, rather than the way a moralist examines a verdict. And if the specific discomfort of that conclusion, that the history of England was shaped not by the will of a tyrant, but by the medical failure of a man who had once been something else entirely, is the kind of discomfort that makes you look at the historical record differently, then you already know what this channel is for, and you already know there are more stories like this one waiting, more decisions that changed the world made by minds operating under conditions that the people making them could not see and could not name. More histories that look like political choices until you examine the medical evidence and find something more human and more tragic underneath.